Hey, my name is John Swiderski, and today I'm giving my presentation on Charles Wesley. He was a very, very important historical figure in the development of the Methodist Church, and that was in part large in the early Americas. So I thought it'd be a good historical figure to cover, especially as it relates to some of the stuff that we've been talking about recently in our class. So his family, his father was Samuel Wesley, who was an Anglican clergyman and poet. Um, and both of his grandfathers were Puritan clergy member, which kind of goes to show that back and forth between the religious beliefs in England, as his grandparents were Puritans and his father was an Anglican clergy member. There was a little bit of difference in belief and theology there. Um, and his mother, Susanna Wesley, was known as the mother of Methodism. And we'll cover that more later on, but it's because her two sons, John and Charles Wesley, are known as the two fathers of Methodism. So he was born in 1707, 2 months premature. So for 2 months, he was wrapped in white wool blankets because that was the practice at the time. And he did manage to survive, although his early childhood was riddled with a lot of different sicknesses. Um, when he was about a year and a half old in 1709, his family home was burned down. I was not able to find the cause of the fire, but luckily, all of the children survived, but it was a very traumatic experience for the family. He was taught by his mother until the age of 8 when he left for Westminster School, which leads me into my next slide on education. So, Charles Wesley was the son of uh, a clergyman, so he was educated from a young age. His mother taught him to read from the Bible, starting from the age of 2. Once he was able to speak, he began to learn how to read from the Bible. Um, After he turned 8 years old, he went to attend the Westminster School, where he continued his early education until his formal education was at Christ Church College, Oxford. While he was there, he started what was deemed a holy club, and it was nicknamed the Methodists by a lot of his peers. He then went on to become an ordained deacon and priest in 1735. Um, he was a bit rushed through this process, and you'll find out why in the next slide. And it's because he would be traveling to America as a missionary. So, a family friend, James Edward Oglethorpe, had recruited John and Charles Wesley to go with him to the Georgia colony as missionaries there for the English citizens in Georgia, as well as to try to convert the Native Americans by sharing the gospel with them. While underway to Georgia, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, he was very impressed by the faith of a Moravian missionary. Um, they were a group of Germans traveling with them to the New World. And the Moravians, their faith was more centered on a personal connection with the Lord. And what impressed him was while they were going through a storm that caused a lot of people to fear for their lives and to panic, these people were completely calm, unlike the rest of the Anglicans on the ship. They were not afraid for their lives. They trusted in the Lord their God. They said that they were not afraid despite the massive storm and the storm surge causing the boat to shake. And what was more impressive to him was the fact that the women and children were also not scared, not just the men, and they all attributed it to their faith. So that had a big impact on him, and you'll see later in his life why. But he did not enjoy his time there. When he actually got to Georgia, the people there were more focused on the economic side of life. They were there for the plantations. It was more of an economic colony than it was a religious colony. And he became very frustrated by his inability to have a strong impact on the lives of those there. And so he viewed his time there as a failure. And it caused him to be really frustrated for some time. And after only a year, he returned back to England in 1736. And for about 2 years, he was downtrodden about his what he viewed as unsuccessful time in Georgia, attempting to minister to people. He met with his older brother John again in 1738, and they both returned to Oxford that same year. He was mentored by a Moravian student there, Peter Bowler. I mentioned it earlier. That was the people that he was impressed with on the boat when he went to Georgia 3 years prior. Um, while being mentored by Peter Bowler, he experienced what he proclaims is a turning point in his personal faith, and that occurred on Pentecost Sunday of 1738, which happened to be on May 21st. And his older brother John had a very similar experience only 3 days later. Um, and like I said earlier, the Moravians focus a lot on a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and on developing that personal relationship with God. So I think that definitely had something to do with it, as he had been raised in an Anglican household. And so he was much more of a moderate, almost Catholic in terms of practice household, uh, and very traditional, very academically focused on the side of religion. He then went on to become an itinerant preacher in England from 1739 to 1756. So he didn't spend very long at Oxford, only about another year. And he was traveling through cities, preaching in town squares, as well as large open area preachings, um, to try to stir up revival and to change the Anglican Church, um, to be what he believed was better than what it was. While he was doing that, he preached alongside George Whitefield in some open area preachings. Um, he's significant because we talked about him in relation to the First Great Awakening in America. George Whitefield would move to New England and be an instrumental figure in the First Great Awakening there, um, as a traveling preacher in early America. In 1749, Charles Wesley settled down. He married Sarah Gwynn, where he stayed with her until they moved to London in 1771, where he had his first kind of permanent residence at a church, and it was the City Road Chapel in London. He died at the age of 80 in 1788 due to illness, which was pretty typical for the time. 80 was a pretty long time to live uh, for the 1700s. His theology was had a very Anglican base to it due to the way that he was raised and educated in England and with his parents that were clergy members and very avid believers in the Anglican faith. However, he was also greatly influenced by the Moravian missionaries in his time in Georgia as well as at Oxford. He believed that there were core doctrines that defined Christians, such as believing in Jesus's death and resurrection, um, the virgin birth, some of these larger, grander signs he believed defined Christians and that all Christians had to believe. However, he he sought more cooperation between different um, forms of Christianity. For example, Calvinists. He didn't agree with their views on everything as far as predestination goes. However, he believed that they should cooperate, they shouldn't hate each other, they shouldn't anathematize each other based on these smaller differences that are somewhat up to interpretation from the scriptures and not clearly defined. His brother John was a separatist Puritan who believed that if the church in England wasn't going to be doing the right things, he believed it was his job to do the right things regardless. And so he ordained two lay preachers, which symbolized the official split from the Anglican Church and the beginning of the Methodist Church. Um, Charles Wesley, on the other hand, sought to stay with the Church of England and proclaimed that he was part of the Church of England until the day that he died. However, his beliefs definitely seemed to align more with the Methodist beliefs than the Anglican beliefs at the time. However, he just did not believe in splitting up the religion. And while they split in the practicing of their faith, John and Charles Wesley remained friends until they died. So they were very close. They exchanged letters, and they both cared about each other until the very end. They did not let their faith divergence create a split between their relationship. Some of his notable hymns are listed here. Hark the Herald Angels Sing is probably the most famous one that I could find. I think probably all of us have heard it, especially around Christmas time. And An overview of his impact. Charles and his older brother John are seen as the fathers of Methodism, which became very popular in early America. He wrote over 6,500 hymns, and many of them are still popular, still read, and still known today. He was an Anglican missionary in early America. While that was only for a year, he did have a pretty big impact through his works later as they made their way across the Atlantic and his hymns were sung here in America. He was an ordained Anglican clergy member. He was an itinerant preacher in England, and he was also the friend and colleague of George Whitefield, who, as I mentioned earlier, was very instrumental in the first Great Awakening here in America. So that's all. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope it was able to provide you with some interesting information.